Please allow me to introduce Manka Bahl, principal correspondent at the Times of India, all the way from India. In her 8-year-long stint as a journalist, she has reported on various beats till she found her calling in environment and climate change. She's always had an affinity for analytical, data-driven stories pertaining to the thermal power sector, air pollution, and environment degradation. 5 of Manka's stories have been converted into suo motu public interest litigations by the High Court here. She's had the chance to interview various crucial personalities, including United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres, COP26 President Alok Sharma, WHO Public Health Director Dr. Maria Neira, etc. At a time when developing countries in Asia are staring at the worst ever climate catastrophes, Manka is aiming to report widely on regional issues, sorting help from science and latest data. Today, she's going to be focusing on environment reporting in Asia. The floor is all yours, Manka. Manka, can you hear us? I'm sorry, I can't hear you. Oh, is that right? Let me help. Design, can you please?
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm sorry, guys. There was some technical glitch. Hi, everyone. I'm Manka. I'm very excited that we're having this talk, few days before COP. So, Stuti, thank you for the wonderful introduction, first of all. Stuti has asked me to talk about reporting on climate change and environment in Asia, which I must tell you all is a very, very tricky business. I think probably the toughest field of journalism that one can take up now. Some years back, it was very hard to imagine environment and climate change news making headlines in mainstream media of the developing Asian world. When I started my career, let's say around 8 years back, environment and climate change were one of my side beats. And I can never forget the time when I would report on illegal felling of trees. And for a large part of the population, seeing this news getting published in a national English daily would be a big joke. And let me admit, as a young journalist, at one point of time, I was embarrassed to report on environmental issues to an extent that I would secretly pray that, okay, no one should cut any trees without permission. There should be no air pollution, so that I could save myself from being at the receiving end of mockery and sarcasm, which would often come from my very own colleagues. Such was the level of awareness of these crucial issues in many developing countries of Asia. Now, I can't clearly pinpoint when the change began, but it was really slow, just like climate change. So today, the very same issue of illegal tree felling, or let's say declining green cover in urban areas, is making front page news. The same people in our countries who would once upon a time not consider these news as newsworthy are now tweeting about it, reporting on it, filing complaints, cases, and demanding stricter punishments. The main concern when it comes to reporting on environment and climate change in Asia has been the denial of government. I have had a wonderful opportunity to cover COP24 as a fellow of Climate Tracker. I was there in New York. And, this has been one of the major challenges that we face because, our own government doesn't give the issue the importance that it deserves. So how are we as journalists, supposed to create mass awareness? For decades, the policymakers were in denial. They could never establish the link between deaths and climate change. And thus, the masses, especially in developing countries of Asia, could never take them seriously. There is absolutely no denying that climate change is a killer. In fact, it has been a killer since quite a long time now. So is COVID. But a big reason why COVID-19 has been consistently the front page news, or the only news that matters, is because the implications are immediately visible. People are dying. The linkage between these deaths with these disease is established, it is well accepted. On the other hand, climate change has been a very, very slow killer. And until recently, many governments, including India, Pakistan, and various other Asian countries, would never publicly admit to deaths being caused due to air pollution or floods or heat waves or various other climate events. Let me give you a fine example from my country. Recently, millions of people lost their lives in the deadly floods in the southern state of Kerala in India. While this news would make headlines in every newspaper, online portals would be telecasted in all the television channels day and night, there were hardly any stories that linked these deaths with climate change. We had scientists, we had experts yelling that the floods were a result of rapid rise of water levels and changing monsoon patterns. But all that the news said was millions are dying due to floods. The bigger picture of what is causing the floods. Floods are not killing people. It is the bigger picture of climate change that is killing people remains to be missing. I think a large part of Asia doesn't absorb the seriousness of how climate change is taking away human lives. And in such a scenario, a big responsibility comes on the shoulders of journalists. It is our job now to highlight this reality. I think till date, one of the key lessons that I have learned in environment journalism is to go deeper and report on the human connect. For instance, I report a lot on dependency of Asian countries on fossil fuels, especially on coal for power generation. When I started reporting on these issues and digging out old reports, I found that most of the media reports focused on textbook data and theories. What are the ill effects of burning of coal? Which gases are emitted? What are the air and how is air and water getting polluted due to it? But these theoretical stories, they never strike a chord with the readers. So what do you do as a journalist? Now, I have been lucky to have an editor who not just understands the seriousness of climate issues, but also its worth in news reporting. So various discussions and brainstorming sessions with my editor give me one of the biggest learning lessons of my journalism career. If you want to tell people how bad climate change is, show them, not just with data and theory, but with ground reality. So, when I started to report on coal-fired power plants, I took a slightly different path. I went to the rural villages that surround the power plants. What I saw and observed was that farmers were unable to grow important indigenous species of crops that led to poor agriculture yield. And why was this happening? Because the fly ash emitted from these power plants would settle on the crops, hampering their growth and affecting their quality. So this gave an agricultural and an economical angle to my climate change story. Due to this, many farmers and their young ones would leave the villages to find some other source of income. So this again gave a climate migration angle to my simple climate change story. Most importantly, the data that we could procure from local healthcare centers showed the high number of respiratory ailments in nearby residents, especially children and senior citizens. So it also reflected a certain number of deaths that were being caused due to diseases like bronchitis and asthma. And this gave a very important angle to a climate change story, which was, how climate change, how burning of coal, how sulfur dioxide emissions were affecting public health at large. So, as reporters, we all need to remember that climate change is not just climate change. It affects human lives, it affects economy, agriculture, GDP, and much, much more. And while, it's a good sign that there has been a significant increase in its coverage in developing countries of Asia, which are the most vulnerable, we also need to remember that our stories should encompass the bigger picture, the relatables, the reality, and most importantly, the human touch. We all know that, in coming times, role of media, especially journalists based in vulnerable countries of Asia, it is going to be very, very critical. So, for us, it is very important to explore what kind of stories we can do as climate journalists, right from data-driven stories, analytical pieces, spot reporting, on-ground reporting, investigative stories, soft features, and right from hardcore human interest ones. The change in style of climate change coverage has to come. We are lucky that, we are living in times where climate change has found a dedicated beat. Every newspaper has an environment reporter, has a dedicated climate change reporter, right from New York Times or Guardian. um, Climate journalist and climate journalism award is now a special category in, many prestigious awards. Climate change news is making front page headlines. So, and we're living in Asia, so let's make the most of it. Let's all write stories that are not just based on theories and textbook science, but let's go deep. Let's find out how it's affecting the human lives. Let's all bring out a clear message and tell people that climate change is a killer and why Asian countries need to act more. This is a very good way to build a pressure on Asian governments who are not at par with their Western counterparts when it comes to mitigating climate change. Thank you, Stuti.
Thank you so much, Manka. That was very insightful. Uh, and I'm actually personally, I'm very excited to read more stories, more climate stories written by you. Um, do we have any questions for Manka? So we do have questions that people have sent over on social media when we were putting out the Hangout information. Uh, so one of them is, are there any reporting trends that you've come across when it comes to Asia, or anything that our community members might want to adapt to?
Yeah, so as I said, the one of the most disturbing reporting trend has been that climate change. The news reports related to climate change are dealt very superficially. There is no in-depth investigation. The stories talk about how people are getting affected from floods, from heat waves, but then as I said in my earlier talk, that we need to go much deeper. We need to talk to as many experts as we can. For climate journalists, I think it is very important to first get well versed with the subjects. Of course, no one is expecting us to be scientists or experts, but a basic understanding of what you're writing. Let's say you're writing on air pollution. Let's say you're writing on coal-fired power plants. So, I mean, a basic understanding that, which can only come from your interactions with experts. Sit with scientists, go meet them for a coffee, sit with experts, talk to them. You don't have to see them as someone you only approach when you have to take interviews or quotes. See them as your mentors. An excellent thing that Chris taught me during one of my fellowships was, go out, talk to people. You never know when you'll find a story. You never know what you learn. So, I mean, this is what happens at COP basically. You don't know when and where you'll meet someone who would just give you a nice piece of information, or who would just tell you something, some concept that you were not aware of. I think this is what we all should practice as journalists from, wherever we are reporting. Talk to as many experts and as many scientists as you can. I think that is the key for efficient environment reporting.
That sounds very well. Another one was if you have any tips for journalists who are just starting out in this field, just starting to report about climate and environment in Asia.
Yeah, so I think I'm not an expert enough to give any tips, but of course I can share my past mistakes with you. Climate change, as I said, is a very vast topic, and it includes everything right from air, water, heat waves, droughts. So, if at the beginning of your career, if you try to be a master of, kind of all sorts of aspects of climate change, you will find yourself getting a little lost, and you will find yourself not being able to deliver what you expected to deliver. So I think the most important tip that I can give you all is find something, even when climate change reporting is your passion, in that find issues that are very close to your heart, very close to your region, very close to your communities, and focus on issue by issue. Like, for if you're living in a country which is affected by cyclones, focus more on that. Focus on one issue at a time, learn as much as you can about it. Don't try to put your hands in everything. And uh, slowly and slowly, when you master one issue, you will automatically start finding its linkage with different other climate crises, and it would be easier for you to report.
That sounds well. Another one was, I think you've already briefly touched upon this, but Asia is vast, and with so many geographies right here in India, for example, it makes it a little too diverse for reporters to pick their pitches on climate. And given that that too is a vast area to cover, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think pitching your climate stories in Asia is a big challenge. But as I said, we are lucky in terms that COP26 is getting more coverage than the Paris Agreement did. So times have changed. Media reporting in Asia is also changing. Countries like Japan, China, Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan, they have dedicated coverage. Their climate stories are making front page news. What we can do is, when pitching a story to our editors, is of course linking local events and linking local stories with the global issue of climate change. So, any local story, for example, air pollution in your city, depleting green cover in your city, floods in your city, you have to find a way to link them with the global scenario, with what the UN is saying. Also, as reporters, try to interview experts that are not just confined in your region. For example, don't be shy when to approach someone from WHO, someone from UN, someone from any international organization to give an expert advice on your story. Take their interviews. That really makes our editors happy. And as I said, always bring in the human touch in your story. This is the best way to pitch climate stories.
Awesome. Do we have any more questions, or can we proceed? All right, if you do save those questions, because we're moving forward, you get a chance to ask them once again. So second up is our extremely talented Reni Karumnan from Philippines, who's currently a PhD researcher at Luxembourg University in the UK and a science communicator at the Tyndall Center for Climate Change Research. The floor is yours, Reni.
Hi, thanks for inviting me to this Hangout. It's nice to be with Climate Tracker again. So I was also a Climate Tracker fellow at first in 2015 at the Paris COP, and I've been observing, I guess, in other COPs in other years. And Manka had really good advice for journalists. So I think I'll just follow up on that as well. And maybe I'll talk about a bit about, COP reporting, how to engage with your audience. So when it comes to reporting about the COP or the UNFCCC, I think it can get very confusing, and that's okay, because anyone who first dives into this whole process will find it really technical. there's a lot of jargons, policy-wise, science-wise. There's a lot of things you will encounter that you wouldn't have encountered if you didn't get into, reporting about climate policy or climate science. Right. So I think my first advice would be you make sure not to get sucked into these technicalities. It's so easy to write about, the technicalities of climate finance, for example, and write about all of these jargons. But at the end of the day, as Manka said, you have to find what is important to your audience. And I think there was a question, Asia is such a wide geography, and that's right. We experience climate impacts so differently, even in our own countries. And I think what's important is to connect all of these technical jargons, all of these scientific jargons, into what's happening, in the communities that you are reporting on, or the audience that you want to talk to. So Manka was right. So for example, if you wanted to talk about climate finance or climate adaptation, how does this relate to, the people on the ground, the communities on the ground that you want to report about? And I guess, that's part of science communication. So if there's anything I've learned working for the Tyndall Center, so I've now kind of jumped from writing for newspapers or news websites to now writing with the researchers. So I'm now working with the researchers who publish very, very technical information about climate change, and I try to translate all of these jargons, to translate all of these technical scientific work into something that's more understandable to the public. And I learned from my work at the Tyndall Center that data is really important, because data provides the evidence to what you're writing about, right? But data and numbers are sometimes not enough to get through to your audience. For example, if a report says, well, for this year, we have only a carbon budget of, 300 megatons of carbon dioxide before we reach 2 degrees Celsius. Right, that is data and that is evidence. But how do we translate that in such a way that it becomes important and more understandable to our audience? What does 300 megatons of carbon dioxide mean? And you can use metaphors, like maybe comparing it to a bathtub being filled with water, or maybe, what we're going to experience at 1.5 degrees, how much is that budget really, etc. And that's really important. I think data and human stories go hand in hand to make a really good story, because you do need the evidence, you do need the data to back up your story, but you also need the human side of it, the faces of the science. Because we can say, for example, these are, there will be, 3 feet of sea level rise by 2050. Right. What does 3 feet of sea level rise even mean? Does it mean that certain small islands like the Maldives will be underwater? And so what impacts will that have on them? Where will they go? And so that even relates to climate migration. So when you see climate change, when you see the science, you also have to see, what kind of stories, what kind of human stories are there linked to the science. And not only that, you also have to, when you write about climate change, you also write about what matters to your audience, if you really want to reach out to your audience. And let me just send a link. Right. So this is called the value chart of Schwartz. Right. And this is what I learned from my mentor, who is the director of the Tyndall Center. And he's been a science communicator for decades. And he introduced me to this value chart. He says, I don't know if you can open it, but if you could see it, you could see the different values, right? So there's self-direction, universalism, hedonism, achievement, security, conformity, tradition, etc. So when we try to engage with and talk to our audience, we have to think, what values are they holding? How do I communicate climate change that aligns with their values? And the values is important because, you know, even if we are in the same country, for example, we all have different values, right? And so my favorite example is Donald Trump. If we want to convince Donald Trump to act on climate change, we will not write stories that are about universalism, right? We won't talk about protecting the environment. We won't talk about social justice, even if that's the right thing. I mean, I consider myself a universalist in this value chart, right? But Donald Trump doesn't hold that value. He doesn't care. He really just cares about power. So at the other side of the spectrum, you know, you have the value of power, which values wealth, authority, public image, social recognition. And so maybe when we write about climate change and we want to talk to people who are like Donald Trump, then we talk about how climate change affects their wealth. How will it affect their business? And how will it affect their public image if they don't do anything about climate change that, you know, people are starting to get behind? So we have to think about what is important to them and what do they hold close to their hearts. So there, you can see there are many different values, and you can start thinking, right, I'm going to write for this particular set of audience, and these are their values. So this is how I'm going to communicate climate change. And it's been really, really useful in writing stories, because it kind of gives you a, instead of like a more generic message, like we should act on climate change, it gives you a chance to personalize your messages more. Because obviously, if we want to reach people of different sectors, of different beliefs, then we have to tailor messages, because there's no one size fits all message for everyone, right? Because we are all different people, we all live in different contexts, we experience every day differently, and we have different priorities in life. And so another example is, you know, if your audience, if you want to talk to people who value their family the most, then our insecurity, family insecurity the most, then we should talk about climate change in a way where it affects, you know, how does it affect your family? How does it affect your children, your children's children? How does it affect your security? How do you become, you know, how is your peace of mind doing in the midst of all this climate change impacts? So that's how useful this value chart is. What else should I say? Oh yes, when we report climate change, there's always that danger that we incorporate fear, right? Because there is all of these, I call them doomsday scenarios. Probably they are right. Like, I mean, mostly they are right because they're done by scientists. Scenarios of the worst cases where we don't do anything and we shot up to 4 degrees above, 1990s global temperature, etc. And you see all of these stories. They kind of pop up every now and then about, it's like a doomsday, right? It's like, okay, so what happens if the audience reads this? And I did my master's thesis on this. And for them, what I found, if people read this kind of things, it immobilizes people. Fear immobilizes people. So instead of actually allowing people to act, and we tend to think, well, if they fear, then they will act on it, etc. Actually, it doesn't, because it makes people think, wow, the problem is so vast and the problem is so big, and you take it to the extreme, and they're like, well, what's the point of acting if we're going that way anyway? So you have to be really, really careful about communicating fear, because it's rarely, if anything, effective. It really isn't. If you want to communicate the dire impacts of climate change, you have to temper it with solutions. Like, right, this is where we're headed if we're not doing anything. But with these climate actions, this is where we can go, right? So for example, right now at the COP, I think we have the ratchet up mechanism, which means that after the Paris Agreement, every 5 years, countries actually have to pledge more climate actions. And so if you're reporting at this COP this year, it will be interesting to see what kind of climate pledges and what kind of climate actions are going to be taken by countries. How much commitment are they willing to take on after 5 years, 5 years after the Paris Agreement. And if you want to write about climate impacts, say, right, this is what sorry, this is what the IPCC says about climate change impacts and where we're headed. But with these climate actions pledged and committed by NGOs, by private companies, by countries, etc., there is actually a solution to the problem that we are facing. So remember that, don't use fear. Always inject hope, because that's how people want to act. That's when people want to act. People want to act most when they are hopeful. And then there's also the issue of climate visuals. And there has been, being in the academe, I've learned about, I guess, effective climate photos. Climate visuals is what we call it. And there have been studies with data and evidence showing, what kind of climate visuals are effective, right? So as journalists, maybe we want to attach photos to our stories, because photos also are very powerful, right? The images, seeing what's happening, the climate impacts, but there are actually a lot of not effective photographs. And so this is based on the climate outreach research. One non-effective photo or visual is a protest photo, right? So as environmentalists, as activists, or maybe as someone who just believes in, climate action, we kind of love to take photos of protests and put them on the front page and hope that people get inspired. Oh my God, there's so many of them. I should join them next time. But actually, the people who like them are the people who are already in the movement. People who you are trying to convince, who are not in the climate movement, actually don't care and actually hate protest photos. They think it's, just not effective. Why are they protesting? It's, hassle, etc. And so you have to be careful about choosing what photos to use, to include in your stories. There's also evidence that show photos that are too far off. For example, polar bears, the Arctic melting. I mean, at first you're like, oh, the polar bear, it's so, cute, and you feel bad about it. But evidence show that it's just that. You don't really want to take action because it's so far. Like, who here has been to the Arctic or the Antarctic? No one has. Maybe a few scientists, but especially for people in like areas where there's no snow even, or there's no ice, it's so far off. Like, who cares? It's so far from me. And people tend to disassociate themselves with stories and with photos that are too far from them. And so if you want to write about climate change, you want to impact people in the communities, you have to show climate change and write about climate change that are closer to home. Because if they are like too far from their reality, they just won't care, even if it's a very cute polar bear in the Arctic, right? So we have to move away from that. What else? Yes, so I think on the topic earlier about having very, very different geographies and cultures in Asia, I think that's important. We have to remember that I mentioned earlier that we live in different contexts and we have different climate impacts that we experience. And maybe what we have to do is focus on, you don't have to write about the whole of India, for example, or the whole of the Philippines. We can always focus a story on just one city or just one island or just one province. It doesn't always have to be a general story. Actually, it's more effective to personalize the stories based on, one small community or yeah, or an island, for example. Um, and what else? I guess the same goes with videos. If you want to capture videos, you also have to be careful about um, the kind of videos that you capture and the kind of photos that you capture in that video. Because there's also that danger. When I was studying media and development, we had a lot of criticisms from, I guess we had a lot of criticisms on stories that are kind of disaster porn, or it doesn't show any empowerment at all. Stories that are just showing, right? Obviously, we obviously there's a tendency for journalists to go to a disaster zone and just take photos and videos of everything, right? And we say these are the impacts of climate change, and it can be powerful. But at the same time, we also have to tell stories. We have to balance that with stories that are solutions based, solutions oriented, and empowerment based. And I say this from a workshop I did recently with an international organization and their members. And they say, you know what, we're really sick and tired of all of these stories that just portray us as victims of disasters or victims of climate change. Because we're more than just victims of climate change. We are doing something in our community, but we're only portrayed as victims. And we want that kind of narrative to change. And I think this comes from a very Western centric view of climate change and disasters, because from the West, we rarely, like here in the UK or in the EU, we rarely feel the impacts of climate change. And so sometimes there's a tendency for journalists, especially in the West, to kind of look at other countries in the global South and say, oh my God, we really pity them because, they're feeling all of these impacts and they're victims of disasters. And that's a very Western centric view. And that's why when we talk about narratives, we will also want to, there's a big discussion right now in the academe as well about how we decolonize narratives about climate change, right? And so it's important for us to view the world not from a Western perspective, but maybe from the ground up, like stories of empowerment, like how are people on the ground actually acting on climate change. There are lots of solution stories on the ground that are never, or maybe very rarely, seen on news. And it's always like disaster after disaster after disaster. And I guess disaster stories are kind of popular because they kind of hit you, like, oh my God, this whole disaster is really what do you say? It has an impact on everyone. But also evidence show that it gets tiring for your audience after a while. Seeing photos of disaster after disaster after disaster, they tend to stop empathizing or sympathizing with people if they see it, if that's the only thing they see, basically. So I'm not sure if that's enough information. I hope it is. If you have any questions, do feel free to ask or send a message.
That was really awesome. Thank you so much, Renee. There were a lot of insights, and I'm sure it'll help us all to report climate better, especially in the context of COP26. If you have any questions, you can put them in the chat and we'll read them out loud. If not, we can move on to the social media questions. So Rennie, let's start with one that I had gotten as a DM. How does one decipher the level of understanding of climate and COP26 amongst readers when reporting?
Right. I think that's very difficult unless you have actually studied like on a survey or something who your readers are. I guess you would know based on, right, the audience of your newspaper or your news website, right? Because certain newspapers have certain audiences. For example, I don't know, but in the Philippines, we have daily newspapers who report in English and who expect people to be more, I guess, educated, finished university levels, or at least high school levels, for example, to be able to understand their stories, etc. So I guess it depends what newspaper you're working for and who their target audience is. But I guess the rule of most newspapers, at least internationally, like The Guardian and New York Times, is to write about climate change or scientific technical issues like you were writing to a 12-year-old, right? And so I think at least that kind of rule ensures that whatever you're writing, whoever you're writing for, whoever reads it, understands what you are saying. So there are online tools that actually, if you copy and paste your paragraph, they tell you what level of, I guess, what level of education, as well as how old your reader is based on the technicalities that you put in your paragraphs.
Cool, that sounds good. There are some questions in the chat. What are you anticipating or looking out for in COP26? How best to filter the amount of information that will come from Glasgow?
Right. So COP26 is actually a really important COP because, you know, it's been delayed for a year. So we have 2 years of negotiations to do. And I think a lot of people are looking forward to what I said earlier, the ratcheting up of commitments, because it was supposed to be done last year. And I think the UK presidency is actually pushing for more finance. So that's another one that's important. And I think one of the presidency is also, the theme is also on sustainable transportation and cities. So there are themes for the COP26. I'm not sure if you've seen it on the website, but the UK presidency already laid out some of the important themes and outcomes that they want to achieve this COP. But I think the most important is the ratcheting up of commitments from the countries. How best to filter the amount of information? Don't even try to follow all of the streams because you will drown in information. I mean, I've been going to COP, right? And when I go to COP, I only pick certain particular streams I would follow. And for me, this is loss and damage, gender and women, and climate change, and sometimes adaptation. So those are my 3 main topics that I follow. So you're free to, I guess, choose which one, because there's lots of things going on. So, you know, you won't run out of options on what you want to, to prioritize.
There's another one. Is it right to demand more from countries who generally improved a lot in terms of their commitment to climate change adaptation and mitigation, or just applaud them for now?
Both. Of course, we have to say congratulations. Thank you for committing all of these already, but we need you to commit more. You know what I mean? So it's like carrot and stick, I guess. I mean, of course, every government who does something, commits something, wants to have a pat in the back, but we all know that these commitments aren't enough. So we can do both at the same time. We can say, oh, wow, they've done well, but they must do more.
Another one, would tackling climate resilience best practices from the healthcare sector make our climate stories more relatable?
Well, health and climate change have always been linked. There are already studies, and you can check. There's a what do you call this? A summary of all the studies from Science Brief. I'll put it here. About diseases and climate change. And there's a lot of evidence saying that, diseases such as those being carried by insects, for example, like dengue, etc., that thrive in, or viruses that thrive in humid, hot places, it's going to get worse. And that's evidence-based. There's already evidence about this. And so when we talk about health and climate change, we can always link them together. Remember that climate change affects all sectors and all industries of society. Like, no one is going to get spared. The healthcare sector, the transport sector, the energy sector, everything is going to be, it's going to be affected by climate change impacts. And I guess there is, let me just check. If you check out Climate Outreach, here, they actually have a guide about how to report climate change in times of the COVID crisis. And one of the things they say is never say that climate change is worse or will affect you more than COVID, because that's very, insensitive, right? Because everyone is going through COVID, everyone is going through this pandemic, and you can't say that, well, climate change is worse. So you have to be really careful about how to communicate healthcare, which is really, really personal to people. People could be going through sickness, and you can't say, well, there's climate change, so you should also care about that. So you have to be careful about how to frame your messages.
Thank you. One last question for this segment. Manka, Reni, whoever wants to take it. This is from Ayaz from Pakistan. The problem I face here is working as a freelance journalist. I face problems to convince the editors who are obsessed with crime and political news when I pitch for climate-related issues. How can I work out on this?
Right. So I can go first and Manka can go next, maybe. That's difficult because as a freelance journalist, you're always, I think, at the beck and call of editors who will approve or not approve your story. And this is a systemic problem more than anything else. Like, it's not just an individual journalist problem, but it's a systemic problem for newspapers / news websites who are into sensationalism and who just want to report on crime and murders, etc. It's really difficult. I don't know. It's really difficult, I guess, to give you an advice on how to change that, because it takes a lot to change the system, right? And I guess my advice would be, for now, can you find another outlet who's more progressive or would want to focus more on other things other than crime and other sensational stories? Because, I don't know how to solve that, really. The whole newspaper needs to change, basically.
Noted. Manka, do you want to add your bit?
Yeah, I think what Renee said is very much true. As you need to change, I think the main media. But one thing, what you can try if you're not looking for any big change, is that try to pitch your stories in a way that it catches the attention of editors. So, for example, recently Pakistan has updated its NTC, and there are many loopholes, many flaws that are being criticized at a global level. At the same time, the NTC also has some really good climate commitments. So, I mean, just to get your editor's approval, what you can try is talking to experts, not just based in Pakistan, but also in other countries, UN experts, WHO experts, on what they feel about Pakistan's commitment, on what they feel about the role Pakistan can play, considering the fact that Pakistan has been largely dependent on Bangladesh, and then again Pakistan is also facing the problem of overcapacity of power generation. So these are issues that are very important, and they are finding a place in global debates. So I think relate taking your local issues to a global discussion is what can help you right now.
Sounds good. Thank you, Manka. Thank you, Renee. I'd like to request the both of you to take the stage and throw some light on climate in issues in Asia.
Can I go first?
Sure.
Renee, do you mind?
No, she gave a thumbs up.
Okay. So, I mean, we all know that Asia is probably, one of the most vulnerable part, and almost 50% of the emissions are alone from our region. Experts say that by 2050, parts of Asia may see increasing average temperatures, lethal heat waves, precipitation events, hurricanes, drought. And what we all need to remember is that these climate catastrophes are not just going to affect environment or public health, but we also have studies that are saying that how rising temperatures and heat waves are affecting working hours of Asian countries. So this is also going to affect our economy at large. And I think while different parts of Asia witness different climate crisis, one of the biggest, what I can say, the climate crisis that Asia is facing right now is that of its dependency on fossil fuels. And as I said, this is again not just a danger to environment, health, but it is also a very significant energy security issue. Um, as I said earlier, countries like India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, they are witnessing overcapacity of their power systems, which also threatens to increase power tariffs. And I think this is this is one challenge that a lot of Asian countries are facing. The steps that India is taking now towards promoting clean energy, setting up very high ambitious renewable energy targets, is a wake-up call for the entire Asia on its potential of solar, wind, and hybrid power generation. Countries like Bangladesh, Pakistan, China, which have been largely dependent on fossils, must now follow these footsteps towards clean energy, towards just transition. Uh, Reliance on fuels is not just it's not just causing climate change issues in Asia, but also socio-economic problems in the already vulnerable nations. What we need to understand is, when we talk about switching from coal to maybe gas or any other source of power generation, what we need to remember is that moving to gas is not an effective solution for Asian countries. We don't need to move from one fossil fuel to another. We need to move from fossil fuel towards renewables. That is what Asia needs right now. And while there's a growing momentum on no more new coal in many parts of Asia, countries like China, Pakistan, Bangladesh, they have announced that, okay, we won't be building any more new coal-fired power plants. But yeah, and the good part is the private sector has moved away from coal. They're not putting any more money in the thermal power sector. At the same time, in countries like India, the regulations on coal-fired power plants are also getting so strict, that the power generation companies have to invest a large amount of money in pollution control technologies. So I think what remains common throughout Asia is that coal-fired power plants are now becoming stranded assets. They are a big burden on countries' economies. But despite all this, it is really unfortunate that the public sector in various Asian countries, including India, Pakistan, continue to invest in coal mines and new coal power plants. This is a major area of concern. When I was reporting in COP24, we had a delegation from India and Pakistan who were making promises of, uh, making ambitious targets for installing solar energy capacity, for installing hydropower in their countries. But, while we were all reporting on this news, what we did miss was the fact that while these countries are planning to increase their renewable energy capacity, simultaneously, what they're doing is they're also investing in coal. This is always the hidden story which doesn't come out in the picture. So while whether we have Prime Minister Narendra Modi or the China government announcing that, okay, these are our clean energy targets, what we don't see is the same policy makers are opening doors and giving environmental clearances to various new fossil fuel projects. I think till that doesn't stop, Asia won't be able to fulfill its promises made in Paris Agreement. It is very important for Asia as a whole to understand that clean energy is in our favor. This I think once this realization come, a lot of climate problems pertaining to this region will find a solution. Another important area of concern at present for the region is the melting of Himalayan glaciers. The melting rate has doubled. The black carbon deposits are accelerating the melting of snow like never before. And I was just going through some analysis of satellite observations across India, China, Nepal, and Bhutan, and they show that climate change is brutally eating the Himalayan glaciers. So what we need is to curb our emissions. Again, as I said, moving away from fossil fuels is a great way to go about it. But to prevent disasters, to protect livelihoods, what Asia needs is an immediate intervention to curb its greenhouse gas emissions. To do this, I think the first step is to identifying different sources of these emissions. And these sources have to be very country specific. Like for India, China, the sources are, of course, coal pollution, transportation. So there are different sources of greenhouse gas emissions for different countries. And I think what is needed is for individual countries to have a mitigation plan of their own, and for Asia to come together as a collective group and have dedicated climate action plans. So while in this battle of the developed and developing world, while the debate has always been, and while Asia stand always been that first we would like to expect developed nations to fulfill their promises, I think this is not the time to just keep expecting and do nothing about our own emissions. This is the time that, yes, when Asia should seek help from the developed nations in terms of finances, in terms of loss and damage, mitigation, adaptation. Yes, Asia and the developing countries in Asia like India, Pakistan, you need to put pressure on the developed nations to commit to what they had assured. But it is also the time to come together and take collective responsibility, to come together and have very clear plans on curbing our emissions. This is not the time to play blame games, and Asia needs to realize this. This is not the battle between the developed and developing world. This is the battle to save our lives, to save the world from climate change. And yes, equity is true, but I think the urgency of the situation demands for every country to step up its ambition. Thank you.
Thanks, Manka. That's very insightful. Renee, you want to talk about this?
Manka had a lot covered. So I guess what I'll just add something like climate change in Asia, you know, we can think about it as mitigation and adaptation, right? We can talk about climate impacts and the need to adapt. We can talk about, you know, how climate change is impacting countries in different ways and what we need to do to adapt to these impacts. And then we can talk about mitigation, as Manka was saying, because there are countries in Asia that are actually quite big emitters. And yes, there's China, there's India, there's Japan. Maybe if you consider Asia and the Pacific, then there's Australia, right? So there are actually quite a lot of countries who are part of the big emitting group in Asia. And Manka was right. I think there needs to be a demand in accountability, especially in these big emitting countries. And I think the main difference for other countries, for example, small island states like Fiji, right, or the Maldives, for example, they don't really emit much. Or, you know, if you talk about Bhutan, they are actually already net zero, so they don't actually need to mitigate anymore, right? And so again, it really depends on what country we're talking about, because I think it's also quite unfair for countries like Bhutan and Fiji and the Maldives, who are like, you know, Fiji and the Maldives are at the brink of sinking. I think some of the islands have already sunk. And when we're talking about these countries, I think we need to talk about climate impacts more than climate mitigation, because they really don't contribute much emissions anyway in the first place. And so it's important to talk about, and when we talk about these things, it's actually in the line of climate justice, right? Because it is true that, you know, other countries are demanding for climate justice from other countries, because it isn't their fault historically. And that's what we should always remember. Like, I don't know, but for me, framing climate change stories and narrative always comes from a frame of the climate justice perspective. Because I think at the end of the day, for us to be able to solve climate change, we need to look at this as a human rights justice issue. You know, it's not just about saving the planet or saving the environment. Actually, I would argue that the planet doesn't need saving. It's the humans that need saving, because the planet will be there and will continue to thrive, will actually thrive without us in it. So actually we're saving humanity and we're saving ourselves, right? And for us to be able to solve climate change in such a way that is just and right for everyone, is to do it in a way where solutions are also just, right? So when we talk about climate change in Asia, for example, you'll hear about talks about creating more solar farms, for example, in some countries in Asia. And when we write about that, you have to scrutinize it. Like, okay, it's good news, right? Solar farms. But is the solution just for everyone? Or is it trying to grab lands from farmers, for example? Because even if the solutions are there. If it doesn't follow the line of being just and right and protecting human rights, it's actually not a right solution. So another example for would be bioenergy, carbon and capture, biomass fuel energy, carbon and capture storage, or BECS. All of these new technologies that are being put on the table that needs a lot of land to store carbon dioxide underground, and that needs biofuel crops, is making a lot of debates. Because while the technology seems like it's amazing, like we can just store carbon dioxide on the ground, where are we going to get all the land for this? What kind of crops do we need for this? Are we able to sustain planting these crops and crops for food, for example? So when we talk about climate change in Asia, we have to be wary about all of these solutions that developed nations are trying to push forward as well, because maybe it doesn't suit us. Maybe it's not just. It doesn't protect our rights as human beings. And I think that's an important point that I wanted to add to what Manka already said.
Sounds good. If there are any questions, you can start leaving them in the chat. I'll just go through one question posted earlier for Manka. Seema wants to know if you can give us some story ideas on geopolitics of India with neighboring Asian countries.
Hi, Seema. Thank you for the question. When it comes to, geopolitics of India with neighboring countries in terms of climate change, what you can always look at is, how the dependency on coal between India, Bangladesh, Pakistan is affecting the country's economies. You can also look at how, what are the similar patterns in these countries, like, in as I was telling, in terms of overcapacity, in terms of let's say continued investments in fossil fuels, how these countries are not just dependent on each other, but the citizens of these countries are being subjected to similar crises. And another good example, that we tried out in TOI was linking climate crisis between different Asian countries, where we highlighted how, where we, for example, compared the air pollution levels of Delhi with China. We compared the clean air policies of India with China, and where China is doing good, where India is going wrong, and vice versa. So I think this is very imperative in reporting, that when you're reporting for your country, you'd not just focus on your country, but also what the neighboring nations are doing, how their actions are affecting you, and how your actions are affecting the neighboring countries. A very good recent example would be how the climate migration in Bangladesh is affecting India significantly. I mean, India is already overpopulated, and now we are witnessing large-scale migration from Bangladesh. So here again lies a great scope for stories.
Got it. There's another one. Why we majorly talk about the impact of climate change in humans? How interesting is it to talk about the impact of climate change in other species and animals? Why the editors are not interested in such stories? There's not a question to a specific person. Either of the speakers can answer, please.
Renee, would you like to answer?
Yeah, sure. I guess because human stories are more relatable. Obviously, biodiversity is important, because without biodiversity, then we're just, breaking the food chain, and humans are doomed anyway. Like, example, if bees become extinct, we will all die, right? We will all die because bees are important part of the food chain. It's how we, it's how food is grown, for example. They're an important pollinator. So I think the key thing is to connect biodiversity to humans. I mean, unfortunately, it's because we're humans and we're concerned about us more than any other species in the world, right? Because we want to save ourselves. And unfortunately, we don't see the connections that are, the connections we have with other species. So this is a good question, and I think we can start putting more importance in biodiversity if we connect it to human experiences. So yeah, Manka.
Yeah, and I think, when a lot of climate stories are also these days related to how, uh, tigers, or, let's say wildlife animals, are getting affected due to climate change. In fact, an award-winning story of India was based on how climate change is affecting the population of tigers. So what Renee said is absolutely right. Connection with humans is more relatable, but then again, we can't deny that climate change is not affecting the biodiversity. So whenever we have these campaigns, these national level campaigns on saving urban forest, we always try to focus on how these forests are not just important for human lives, in not just important to curb air pollution, act as filters, but also how these forests are home to a large number of biodiversity species. And chopping off these green lungs will, will take away home, will take away a thriving biodiversity habitat, which is again very important.
Yeah, that sounds nice. Thank you for answering the questions. Wasim, I hope they're answered. Um, we're actually running a little behind time, so we'll quickly get to the next one. Before moving to the final segment, actually, we'd like to let you guys know that Climate Tracker Asia has recently launched its weekly newsletter, which will have all the latest news, opportunities, updates, and more. We're putting up the link in the chat for you guys to subscribe. And moving on to the next section, we at Climate Tracker Asia want to talk about our recently launched website, that is climatetracker.asia, that is meant to cater journalists like yourselves. I'd like to invite the team of researchers who've been working tirelessly to get this in time for COP26. And yeah, over to you, Yvonne, Quimby, and Langit to introduce your prized possession.
Hi, sorry, my background's not really working very well. But yeah, so I'm Yvonne, I'm from Malaysia. And together with Kimby and Langit, the three of us are basically the researchers for this website, which I will put in the chat. And I'll just share screen if that's okay, of like the website. Oh yeah, I can't do that. Let me just try. Okay, but I mean, I guess you can go on your own. But basically, what we wanted to do with this website is we wanted to sort of create a platform that journalists and anyone can just kind of basically, we wanted to create sort of like an ecosystem on a website we are developing specifically for Asian climate advocates and journalists. And unfortunately, we've only had Philippines, Indonesia, and Malaysia so far, but hopefully it'll be a starting point. And we wanted to create sort of an online news platform tailored to sporting journalists across the region to get contacts, sources, framing ideas, and insights. So it has sort of like a database of thematically focused background briefings. We have, as Stuti mentioned, weekly newsletters on key climate updates and regional politics, and also links to regionally focused media network in the three countries, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Philippines, and also weekly news roundup of climate news in Asia. If you go to the website right now, we have our first round of briefings to do with COP26, because a lot of things that we hear from journalists is that they can't find climate journalism that is specific to Asia, to specific to India, to Pakistan, to Malaysia, to Philippines, and hence that's why there's not enough climate news being produced, because they're unable to find information on it. So hopefully we're hoping that together with this project that we're doing, where we create sort of a one-stop shop for climate journalists across the ASEAN region, to kind of basically be a place where you can go to for research, press release, news, and to write your own climate stories from there. Yeah, so I guess I'll pass to Kimbi to kind of explain more.
Thank you, Yvonne. Hi, everyone. I'm Kimbi from the Philippines. So thank you for joining us today. Actually, as a researcher, we want to get as much as information that you need for you to write your climate stories. So today we're very excited to share with you guys the list of topics that we have been working on for a couple of weeks now. Just a little background, actually. We had a focus group discussion together with journalists from Malaysia, Indonesia, and Philippines. And we asked them about how we can tailor the information that we will be featuring in our website. And of course, we're very grateful for all the feedbacks and of course the suggestion from them. So from there, we come up with the list of topics. So among the topics that we are working on and what you'll be expecting to see on the website in the few weeks now will be, of course, the COP26 primer, which is already up on the site. So just in time for the COP26 summit. And also, we will be featuring briefs about each country's net zero goals, which is also related to the COP26. And aside from that, we will be focusing on topics related to deforestation and forest policies in the three countries. Actually, as much as possible, we want to make your life easier. So we are trying to get, we will be collaborating with each other. So Langit, Yvonne, and I will be collaborating to create briefs that will be, it's actually a shared content from each country, like the sea level rise. So you'll get to get information from the three countries, and actually three countries in one brief. That's the concept. So we also want to know if what language would you prefer in our briefings, because we actually Langit is writing her brief in Bahasa and mine will be in English and Filipino. So this is actually the time we can ask you what language would you prefer with our brief to make your life easier. So we will also be uploading briefs focusing on sustainable agriculture and food security, disaster risk, resilience, indigenous people and climate justice, climate finance, energy transformation, and of course, waste management. So we're still working on this topic. So if there's anything you want to include, of course, you can just email us, or right now you can suggest what are the topics that you want to include in our brief. So yeah, that's it. I think I'll have to pass it to Langit to discuss the other features of our website. Langit.
Okay, thank you so much, Kimbi, and also Yvonne. Thank you so much, everyone, for being with us today. To add what Yvonne and Kimbi has already said to you, we really like super agree with what Manka and Rene has already said before that. Okay, so the issue about the environment and also climate change is really complex, right? We have lots of jargons, we have lots of scientific terms, technical terms, and sometimes it's really easy to get lost, not only lost in the terms, but in some case, for example, like in my country, Indonesia, um, the thing is sometimes you have to like translate the whole terms into bahasa Indonesia, our the national language, and sometimes things get lost in translation. So we agree that it's really important to be able to get to communicate with as many experts as possible from other countries, as well as to get well versed, right, in the things. That's why we also provide you with two other features that we are currently still working on. So it's still in development, basically. The first one is expert. So here we tried our best to be able to provide you with several profiles of experts, local experts in Malaysia, Philippines, and Indonesia on different topics. So here we need to highlight as well that these experts basically have agreed and given their consent to be featured in this website. So please feel free or don't hesitate to contact them. We also provide you with their affiliation, so you can check them up if you want to know, like probably okay in these topics, which institution we can contact. And what's really interesting as well, that these experts, they actually provide us with commentaries, their opinions on certain topics based on their expertise. So you can also directly just quote their commentaries if you need them, as long as you just like mention the source from this expert and also from Climate Tracker Asia. So please let us know if maybe there are some infos that we need to incorporate more. For now, we have about like some up-to experts that we will try to keep adding. Many of them can easily be contacted via emails, social medias. So please do so. And then the other features that we are also working on basically is glossary. Because even as researchers, we also realize that, oh my God, there are so many abbreviations, so many jargons, especially when they're in English and needs to be understood in our local language, that really need to understand that. That's why we are working on glossary. Maybe if we can open the glossary just to give some idea how it looks right now, that would be super great. Okay, so basically for now, we are trying to put, like for example, the term greenhouse gases, for example, we provide the explanation in English and then in Filipino, in Bahasa Indonesia and also Bahasa Malaysia, because sometimes each country have different terms to use. But basically we want to try our best to be able to be helpful for you. So those are basically two of other features that we are working on right now. Since this website is basically for you, we're trying to tailor this as much as possible for to support your reporting. Really, we're really open. Please let us know how else we can be helpful to you from the features that we have already working on. So I think that's all so far. Kimbi and Yvonne, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think we've said everything. And I think as Bianna posted in the chat, that these briefings you can just kind of copy and paste, because we understand that when you're writing on climate, sometimes you just need to put in a little background, and that's what the briefs are for. You can just kind of cut and paste and just directly credit Climate Tracker, and you can spend more time into researching more about what you really want to for climate journalism. Yeah, we're just here to kind of aid you guys.
And also, we just want to know, are there other topics that you want to be included in the list of briefs so we can search on it and then include it in the website or on the website?
You can just leave them in the comments in the chat, and we'll make sure that we go through them and take them forward. Now, quickly, just wrapping up, I want to thank you all very, very much for joining. Thank you, Manka. Thank you, Renee. Renee has to rush. It was truly an enjoyable session, and it was an exceptional discussion. And I hope that we all meet very soon again. And if you have any questions or if you need any help, please reach out to us. There are multiple ways. We have our communities, we have our WhatsApp channel, we have our Facebook groups. We're available on WhatsApp. We're available on our email IDs as well. And well, you now have climatetracker.asia as well to reach out to us. And before I say goodbye, we'd like to take a group picture. So I encourage anyone who can turn on their videos just for a couple of seconds. And we'll just wrap up post that. There we go. That should be good. Thank you, guys. This looks really nice. It looks like all of us have actually gotten together and we've been trying to get all of the Asia community together for a while. It's really nice to see you all here. Thank you and have a lovely evening ahead. Bye.